Thank you. So don't worry about, if your questions, put all your questions in the chat, and we will be replying all your, questions as soon as possible. And we thank you for your time. So before we move on to Dr. Darin, I just want to give a small introduction to Cocotown because we see a lot of new faces for this webinar. Yeah, we are very happy because Darren's name has attracted so many people from around more than 45 countries, and more than 200 people have registered for today's webinar. But not all of them are going to be online because of the time differences, but they will be watching that video later on the recording. So there's a small brief introduction I'm going to share about Cocotown. So Cocotown was started, if you look at our origin, the parent company is called InnoConcepts. The parent company is InnoConcepts, and we founded it in 1992. So we started trading innovative specialty food processing machines. So that was something different for immigrant Indian women to start in those days, because most of them were in software and computer related businesses. But we wanted to be different. We wanted to bring innovative machines. So we started InnoConcepts for innovative. And then we primarily focused on machines for making South Indian foods. And we recognized over the years that our machines can be used for different purposes, not just the South Indian food. So whenever somebody buys the machines, other than the Indian name, I call them and talk to them and find out what they are using for. And then in 2007, when the recession hit, we had to pivot to stay on business. So what we found is there is a new avenue. So we wanted to focus on an industry where we can make a difference, because we always believed in being different and a leader. So we didn't want to be the Me Too product. So we were looking at different things. And then we recognized in 2006 that only very few people could make chocolate, but they had to invest millions of dollars. And then there were some chocolate makers, they were trying to make small batches, like 5 kilos or something like that, but they didn't have the uh, right equipment. So in 2009, we started Cocoa Town with the objective to facilitate the evolution of cocoa as a superfood. And we wanted to enable the chocopreneurs with the machines at affordable prices. And also we wanted to help them to make chocolate as a healthy food instead of junk food, because we all know cocoa has so much superfood qualities. But when we eat as a candy chocolate, we are losing all those benefits. And then in addition, we also helped cocoa farmers to add value addition to their beans, because now they could sell their beans as a flavor beans at a higher cost and increase their income potential than selling as a bulk beans at a lower price or commodity prices. So this is the small Cocoa Town timeline. Is also on our website. So I'm not going to spend too much time. But in from 1992 all the way to 2017, we have a lot of patents, and also now we have the complete line of machines for 4 different scales. And then again, we were growing this business, and then again 2020 we had to change our objectives and pivot. So now we want to empower the chocopreneurs and cocoa farmers through education, equipment, and evaluation tools. And also we want to create a cocoa varsity online to provide resources for the anything chocolate, fine chocolate. And also we want to develop new line of machines and accessories. So what is the future? Yeah, I know this year has been very hard for a lot of us, because we had to stay put in one place, and then like we had to go through a lot of difficulties with the reduced sales and not able to even visit family members and things like that. But we are hoping, so the 2021 will bring a better life for us. We will return to normal life and meet friends and family in real life, and we will have the in-person connections, because we really miss going to the trade shows and seeing our customers all over the world. And I just want to end with this one. We call it Sloka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu. That means We want our actions make the whole universe happy and better place and healthy place. And then we want to thank all of our families, employees, customers, farmers, mentors, industry leaders, industry organizations, and the God and the universe for giving us an opportunity to help others. And for today, we have a big thank you for Dr. Darin Sukha, because he was gracious enough to give us this webinar so people can get benefit. And if you need to contact us, we are available on phone, Skype, email, and web. Thank you. And now I will turn over the mic to Dr. Darin Sukha.
Very much, Mrs. Balu. Um, Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are today. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, and I would like to start off by thanking each of you for taking time out of your busy Saturday morning or Saturday schedule to spend time with us, with me, to explore something that I can actually talk about for, for a very long time, for weeks, for days. Looking at the relationship between post-harvest processing and quality attributes in the cocoa beans. I had asked for some information on the demographics of the people that would have registered for this webinar, and I was really heartened to see that over 230 persons would have registered for this from over 50 countries. Literally from USA to Uganda. And I'm really humbled by this experience and the response. And I would like to thank Dr. and Mrs. Balu and the team at Cocoa Town for the opportunity, for the invitation rather, and the opportunity for this platform to speak to you on this topic. And I know it's a very important topic. I've been working in, I work at the Cocoa Research Center of the University of the West Indies, located at the St Augustine campus of the university in Trinidad and Tobago. The Cocoa Research Center is amongst the world's oldest cocoa research institutions. We were established in 1930. At that point in time, Trinidad was amongst the top 5 producers of cocoa in the entire world. This was before West Africa started to increase their production, and witch's broom disease entered Trinidad at that time. And it had such a devastating global effect that it was decided to site this Center of Excellence in Research in Trinidad in 1928. That disease entered, and very shortly after, the decision was made to site the research center at what was then the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture. At that point in time, Trinidad and Tobago was a British colony, and the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture was the center of excellence to go to learn about tropical agricultural crops. So the Cocoa Research Center has worked continuously since that time to now. We have 3 pillars. First one is that we curate the International Cocoa Gene Bank Trinidad, which is the world's largest and most diverse collection of cocoa varieties in the public domain. We conduct research in different thematic areas, looking at production, productivity, disease tolerance, quality, post-harvest processing, flavor. And I lead the food technology team at the Cocoa Research Center. I've been working there for 25 years now, and it's been quite a journey to see the change or the evolution in how the industry approaches quality and the whole concept of flavor. And before, when I started this work in 1995, people only focused on productivity and how to minimize disease, but very little attention was paid to actual to quality in the context of flavor. So to witness this evolution and change in mindset and market differentiation associated to recognizing and rewarding flavor and quality, for me, has been personally very gratifying. So it is indeed a pleasure to spend this time with you. So I want to make this interactive. So you can put your questions in chat and I will see how we can address all of them. Um, if not in the question and answer session, at least later on via the blog or the chat that we will set up. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now to begin this presentation. And I will actually end with a short video that sort of highlights some of the aspects of the work of the Cocoa Research Center that will actually be more meaningful when I show it at the end after the presentation, because it ties everything together. Right. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between post-harvest processing and quality attributes in cocoa beans. And I'm keeping a very simple learning objective, and I want us to bear this in mind as I talk. I really want us to understand, internalize, and concretize the link between post-harvest processing on flavor and overall cocoa bean quality that goes into chocolate making. Because you cannot make good chocolate if you have poor quality cocoa beans. Just like any recipe that you follow, if you have poor quality ingredients going into that recipe, you can only make poor quality food. So by way of outline of this presentation, firstly, I'm going to define quality in cocoa. It sometimes appears to be nebulous, but there is a definition that exists that can hopefully clarify things that are unclear. And we're going to look at the factors affecting flavor development, where I'm going to systematically deconstruct it in terms of genotypic and pre-harvest factors, and then look at post-harvest factors. And sometimes the easiest way to teach and to learn is to understand what happens when things go wrong, problem-based learning. So I'm just going to share some thoughts and some slides and images of what happens when things go wrong, and then speak about food safety concerns.
Okay.
And I'm going to have a special note on cadmium, because that's a particularly important food safety concern at the moment. And then I'm going to speak about the critical control points that we need to consider for cocoa quality, drawing on the HACCP approach, the hazard analysis critical control point approach, that really is the hallmark of systems approach in the food industry and in industry in general. So even though we may not have a HACCP certification for cocoa quality, we can employ a HACCP-based approach to the logic we employ to produce quality. And then I'm just going to summarize in a few takeaway points to bring home the message again of post-harvest linked to quality. But first, I want to clarify the word cocoa and cacao. Many cultures use the word cacao. Sometimes the word cocoa is used. Some people are confused which one is correct, when we should use cacao versus cocoa. And this is from the International Trade Center, which is the world governing body for trade in commodities. There's no general rule that's consistently applied. Some use the term cacao when describing the scientific and horticultural aspects of the plant, the harvested pod, and the beans are during fermentation. And they switch to cocoa once the beans have been fermented and dried. And cocoa sometimes is used to describe the product made. So you have drinking cocoa, right? I'm just going to define it, say how I'm going to use it in this talk. For me, both terms are correct at any time, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. It depends on the context and how the speaker is using the word. So I'm just going to use cocoa throughout this presentation, because it's just easier for me for the English tongue to say cocoa as opposed to cacao. So I'm going to talk about cocoa quality. As I mentioned, the definition of quality sometimes was unclear. And in 2015, the European industry actually came up with a very holistic definition of quality that considers aspects of flavor. So the first thing that the industry recognizes as important in defining cocoa quality is flavor. Then we have purity, and I will describe some elements of that just now. Then we have physical characteristics that have a direct bearing on the manufacturing performance of the beans. So flavor, purity, physical characteristics are all linked to the bean itself. And then the more holistic element of this definition considers now traceability, geographical indications, and certification to indicate the sustainability of practices to produce these beans. So just to go into some detail of what this definition really considers, the words that I have highlighted here. Flavor. Flavor in this instance refers to the absence of defects and the presence of positive aromatic attributes. Purity in this context refers to food safety. Food safety in terms of the absence of physical, chemical, and microbial impurities. So when we're sorting through the cocoa beans, as at the start of making chocolate, you would remove cocoa-related foreign material like pieces of shell, pieces of placenta, etc. Then we have non-cocoa-related foreign material that would be sticks and stones and pieces of branches, etc. I have had the opportunity over the past 2 decades to visit almost every chocolate company, one of their factories. And I have seen so many things in the context of foreign materials that come into cocoa. I have seen boulders, not small pebbles, boulders. I have seen horseshoes, belt buckles, metal spikes. I have seen empty ammunition casings. All of these things make up physical impurity. Then we have the chemical impurities, pesticides, you have cadmium, etc. Then we have the microbial impurities, which would cover ochratoxins and any of the foodborne microbes that we need to be aware of in terms of E. coli, salmonella, etc. Then we have the physical characteristics in terms of the consistency of bean size, which has an impact on how these beans go through the chocolate making process, how they are roasted, how they go through the grading and sorting process. And in terms of the yield of edible material, small beans have more shell in the context of surface area to volume ratio. So shell accounts for about 12% of the bean weight. So if you have smaller beans with more shell, then you're spending more time handling stuff that you would throw away, that you don't use. So this is where the physical characteristics come in. If you have inconsistent bean size, you have inconsistent roasting. Some beans get burnt, some beans would be under roasted. Then we have cocoa butter characteristics in terms of the yield of cocoa butter and hardness. We have color potential in terms of a premium associated with light breaking beans, beans where the cotyledon is a light in color, like Criollo-like beans or Criollo beans. And then we have the range of certifications that are linked to quality, linked to traceability, linked to geographical indications or origin, sense of space, terroir. Then we have the social, environmental, and organic certifications. So you see the new definition of quality in cocoa is very holistic. And all of these criteria affect value and price. It affects the market appreciation for these beans and how much people are willing to pay for them. So what are some of the drivers in a cocoa flavor development? And you see I have 2 images here, one of a baby and one of a teenager. Each bean has a genetic flavor potential. There's a genetic composition that exists that is expressed based on how the tree is treated in terms of the pre-harvest environment, the care and attention to the agronomy affecting the yield, the production, the productivity, the incidence of pests and diseases, and then the farmer, how the farmer expresses that genetic flavor potential. So it's like adopting a baby or having a baby, where there's a clean slate, where you can introduce new thoughts, new ideas to unlock that potential. By the time a chocolate maker gets a bean that's fermented and dried, it's like if you were adopting a teenager, where the personality of that bean is already expressed and locked in. So if you have poor quality beans, there's very little you can do through roasting, formulation, and conching to deal with any of flavors that might exist. So you see, the pre and post harvest environment is where you have the potential to impact or have the most amount of change in terms of expressing that genetic flavor potential. And I'm focusing on flavor because we're all here in this webinar because we're interested in flavor, in not just making chocolate or producing cocoa beans for chocolate, but producing cocoa beans and making chocolate that are experiences in themselves, where if I wanted to eat chocolate, I can go buy a Cadbury, a Mars bars, a Snickers bar. If I want to experience chocolate, I want to really appreciate a depth and breadth of flavor, then I would buy a piece of craft chocolate or piece of origin chocolate that transforms me or takes me onto a journey to really experience a flavor potential that is quite different to mainstream chocolate. Okay, so I'm going to I have a red mark on my screen here. I don't know how to remove that. Okay, so I'm now going to look at the factors affecting flavor development, and I'm going to break it up into two parts. We have the genotype and pre-harvest environment, and then we have the post-harvest environment. With respect to the genotype and pre-harvest environment, we have location of the farm, so quality starts from where the farm is located. Is this farm in an area that's very wet or very dry? Is it in an area that's very flat or very hilly? How is the terrain? Because that impacts the ability to make infrastructural changes to the field to create an environment that's most suitable for the tree to produce cocoa pods with a low incidence of pest and disease. So for example, if I'm in an area that is very low-lying, where there's a lot of rain, in a place that's not well drained, I would have a lot of flood or issues with flooding or water in the field. And a lot of the diseases that affect cocoa are fungal diseases. Similarly, if I'm in a dry area and I have to bring water to my cocoa trees, then I might have less problems with pest and disease because it's not so humid. But I have to make sure that my trees get enough water so that they can produce enough pods, so they are not physiologically stressed. So the location of your farm it starts there. Quality starts from where your cocoa farm is located. Then we have the genotypes, the trees, the varieties. There's a genetic potential, as I mentioned. We have the different varieties. So if you look at the image below, the photo below, these are pods taken from one farm in Trinidad, and you can see they're very nice pods. They're fully mature, ripe. They're not diseased, but we have differences in bean size. This bean here is very small. This is much bigger. So there's a potential that exists. So imagine if you have a mixture of these small beans and these big beans in a fermentation mass, you would have some variation in quality based on the proportions of mixtures of small beans and big beans. Then we have the pulp, etc. So we have the genotype of variety, agronomy, and pest and disease management linked to the locational requirements or demands. A tree that is well taken care of will produce for you. A tree that is under physiological stress will not produce for you. Then, of course, we have the seed-based attributes in terms of pulp, seed size, etc. The next set of factors that affect flavor development in cocoa are linked to the post-harvest environment, where we have fermentation, drying, and storage. And you can see this progression here of wet beans going into fermentation, during fermentation, at the end of fermentation and drying. And I link it back to chocolate, because the reason why it is we are really engaged in the enterprise of growing cocoa is to either make chocolate for ourselves or to sell beans to someone who will make chocolate and to get the best possible price. So therefore, the greatest potential for impacting flavor development is during fermentation and drying. And I like to call this unlocking that genetic flavor potential. And there is a continuity, a continuum that exists in that process of unlocking genetic flavor potential to the end point of chocolate. So one of the key learning points is to understand that continuum that exists. So yes, you may occupy a certain point in that cocoa value chain, but you are inextricably linked to what happened before. All right, so looking at genotype and pre-harvest factors, we have the origin and variety. We have types that have dark beans, types that they are more what you call forastero-like. And of course, you know, there's no more forastero, but we understand that there are at least 10 different genetic groups in what was considered forastero. We have those that are criollo-like, or those that are criollo, where we have pale beans. And then we have the aspect of pollination compatibility. Now, this is not something that is often paid attention to, but it is very important, because you have two things. You have the pollination compatibility of the variety, where they're either self-compatible, self-incompatible, or cross-compatible. So you might have a field planted of varieties that are self-incompatible, and they are not as well cross-compatible, so you will not get a lot of pods or yield from those varieties. So understanding the pollination compatibility of the varieties that you select and grow is very important for your yield. There's also a link to show pollination, pollen donor effect on bean size. And if we do not have pollinators, you could have, and you do not have self-compatible trees, you will also have lower yields. So the presence and activity of pollinators are very important. You have to promote their presence and their activities. And the dominant pollinator in the cocoa farm is actually the midges. They're very small because the flowers are very small. So they need humid conditions. And of course, we have the genetic potential of a variety. If we have a variety that has a potential to only produce cocoa flavor or chocolate flavor, we cannot expect that variety to produce floral or fruity flavors. It doesn't have that potential. So we have to understand the flavor potential of the varieties that we grow, so that we can treat the varieties in the appropriate conditions to express that potential. Next looks at agronomy and pest and disease management. And this is in a pre-harvest range of factors where we look at the growing environment. We have soil fertility, soil topography, flooding, and drainage. And I mentioned those things because they're also linked to the in terms of agronomy. Do you need to augment soil fertility? If you have a high soil cadmium, how do you the soil chemistry so that cadmium is not available to the plant for uptake. If you have a field that is very hilly, what varieties do you plant? How do you treat those trees? If you have a field that's prone to flooding, how do you handle drainage, etc.? And then we have pest and disease susceptibility. So you need to understand what are the diseases that are present in your environment. We have black widow, we have Crossover disease, we have witch's broom disease, are some of the three major diseases. They're not present, but with the exception of black pod disease, that's present all over. Falciparum is not present in most of the Caribbean, thankfully. It's in South America. There is no witch's broom disease at the moment in West Africa. So understanding the diseases that are present and what you can do in terms of cultural activities, in terms of field management to control these diseases, as well as the susceptibility or resistance of the varieties that you plant are very critical things, because planting a cocoa field is a long-term investment. And if you have varieties that are planted that are susceptible to the most prevalent disease that you have, then that affects the bean quality that goes into fermentation. It affects the pod quality, and it affects yield, and could affect the quality of beans that ultimately end up going into fermentation. So now we'll look at seed-based attributes, where we have pod ripeness, pod quality, and pod storage. So we have three things to bear in mind. We have pods that are fully mature and unripe, pods that are fully mature and ripe, and pods that are overripe. They represent three different physiological states. So if we have pods that are fully mature but unripe, the seeds are not fully developed. The placenta and the pulp are tightly bound. There are not enough free sugars present to facilitate optimal fermentation. We want a pod that is fully mature, ripe, undiseased, where the seeds are fully developed. We have a loose bound pulp and placenta, softer texture. We have the correct amount of sugars that are present to initiate or facilitate the fermentation process. The last category is where we have overripe pods. This is a big problem for bean to bar chocolate segment, because these beans actually go into a fermentation. When a pod stays on the tree for too long, it starts to germinate inside, because there's a germination inhibitor that's present in the pulp. And when the pod respires or breathes on the tree, it gets drier inside to the point where that germination inhibitor is deactivated and the seeds germinate inside of the pod. And these seeds going into fermentation, they are no longer in a physiological state for optimal expression of flavor. The point where the root or radicle would have emerged usually drops off or falls out during fermentation and drying, and creates a ready entrance point for mold and for insects. And these beans end up into, they were past grading, and they would often have mold inside. They do not have a good flavor profile present. And if they constitute a large portion of a roast batch that goes into micro batch for bean to bar chocolates, then you have poor quality flavors, or poor quality flavor development, or poor flavor development. Also, if you have diseased pods going into fermentation, well, these seeds, these beans are in no way suitable for fermentation. Many of us, in many farms, the machete or the cutlass is the tool that's used for everything, for pruning, for weed control, for care of the young trees, for harvesting pods, for opening pods. And that machete or cutlass can damage a pod. And if that pod is stored for some time before going into fermentation, let's say You harvest your pods from Monday to Wednesday. And on Thursday, you would crack these pods, extract the beans, and start the fermentation on Friday. During those 3 days of storage, if you have a pod that's damaged, whether or not it's from a machete or a bird, a woodpecker, etc., those beans would start to ferment, or they would get a secondary mold infestation, and that would yield to not optimal quality beans going into fermentation. So we have to look at seed integrity, the amount of pulp, the moisture content of that pulp, the pulp acidity in terms of the pH, and the pulp bricks in terms of the sugars that are present. All of these things are important factors that facilitate optimal microfloral succession during fermentation. In many instances, the reality that exists for fermentations, many fermentations that occur in many places, is this top image here, where we have these black beans that would have come from a disease or damaged pod going into fermentation. The, the, the exception, or what we should have, is what we have in the bottom, where we have really fully mature, ripe, undiseased pods, beans going into fermentation. So let's talk about fermentation a bit. So we have people from different countries, different parts of the world, where there are different fermentation methods that are employed. We have heaps, we have trays, we have baskets, we have boxes, boxes that are arranged in a line, boxes that are arranged in a cascade environment. We have boxes that are made out of wood. We have boxes made out of plastic, etc. So the method of fermentation varies, but it's really to try and achieve the same thing, to facilitate an optimal microbial succession to unlock that genetic flavor potential. In some countries, we have some pre-treatments that are used before fermentation occurs. So for example, in Ecuador, for CCN 51, there is the process of pre-drying the beans for 2 or 3 days before it goes into fermentation. So you remove some of that excess moisture that is present in the pulp. In some countries, you have pressing or washing of beans before it goes into fermentation. So these post-harvest pre-treatment options affect the succession of microorganisms during fermentation. Now, something that's very important in fermentation is the aeration or turning that occurs. So the manipulation of this fermentation mass during fermentation affects the rate of fermentation, it affects the microbial succession. So if, for example, we have excessive aeration or turning, we tend to have a very rapid cycling of the microbial populations. So we actually do not get optimal flavor development. And I'll go into some more detail about that in the next slide. By the next token, if we have limited aeration or limited turning, we have a very long lag phase in fermentation where the yeasts that normally start off a fermentation, they take a long time to become established throughout the fermentation mass. So you actually end up getting putrefaction occurring. So the homogenization of the fermentation mass during fermentation is very important for aeration, for redistribution of microorganisms throughout the fermentation system to facilitate that optimal microfloral succession for optimal endpoint of fermentation. And I will go into some more detail about that. But just to add this, some exciting work that we are now getting into at the Coco Research Center is applying the whole technology of omics to fermentation, where we want to explore microbiomics, metagenomics, and metabolomics to understand the contribution of the microorganisms that exist in the environment, how they become inoculated into the fermentation matrix, and how the populations evolve during fermentations and their contribution to a fermentation, and then understand the impact of their metabolic processes to flavor development. So this is an exciting application of DNA sequencing technology that we are looking forward to really take a deep dive to better understand what's happening in fermentation, so we can better um, control and optimize what happens during fermentation. So hopefully in the next talk that I give, I can speak a whole lot more about this. But I just wanted to let you know, we as scientists, we are never satisfied. We always want to push the envelope to understand what's more, what's out there, how deep can we go. So this is the next level down that we're going to really understand what happens during fermentation. Right. So this, in my mind, is perhaps one of the most important slides in this webinar, where I really want to go through the the fermentation process with you. I want you to focus on the graph on the top right hand side here, where we have the different color lines: red, blue, green, gray, and pink lines. Red is yeast, blue is lactic acid bacteria, and gray is acetic acid bacteria. So fermentation starts off with an initial inoculation from the environment, from the workers' hands, from the tools that the workers use, the banana leaves that the extracted beans would come in contact to. Um, the understanding, of course, is that the beans inside of the pod are sterile, and we are going to check this in the omics studies to really to see how true this is. Once it comes out of the pod, it automatically starts to become inoculated with things that exist in the environment. We have a number of insects. We have fruit flies. We have flies. We have wasps. All of these insects come to get juices, butterflies, bees, etc. And they bring with them a mixture of microorganisms that tend to be unique to the environment in which the inoculation is occurring. And it starts off as a yeast-based fermentation, where it occurs under anaerobic conditions, where we have the pulp of the beans really forming an airtight seal next to each other, and we have yeasts and enzymes breaking down the pectin present in the pulp, and the yeast breaking down the sugars to produce ethanol or alcohol. So if you were to smell beans going into fermentation, it smells nice and fresh and fruity. Then very quickly, after 1 or 2 days, we start to get the smell of alcohol. Now, at the same time happening, we have lactic acid bacteria that are also present and trying to establish themselves in this fermentation matrix. And this is where turning is very important. Turning serves to redistribute the yeasts and some of the lactic acid bacteria as well throughout the fermentation matrix, throughout the mass. But that aeration also tends to deactivate the lactic acid bacteria. Now, lactic acid bacteria produces lactic acid, which smells and tastes like spoiled milk. So if you notice, if we turn after the second day, we have a drop in the activity of lactic acid. So you can see it here, it drops after the second day. And then we have a sort of increase in the production of acetic acid, but we also have what happens is a decline in the activity of the yeast because they utilize all of their substrate, all of the sugars present. They produce alcohol, they produce some heat as well. So they create conditions that are not favorable for them. So they use up their resources and they create an environment that is unfavorable for their existence, which sounds almost exactly like what we're doing with the earth, but there you go. What happens at the same time, whilst this population of microorganisms are declining, we have the acetic acid bacteria that feed off of the alcohol that is produced by the yeasts, and they become the dominant microorganism that is present. And this is where the acetic acid bacteria operates in the aerobic step of fermentation. So what happens here, we have the acetic acid bacteria feeding off the ethanol, the alcohol produced by the yeasts, producing acetic acid or vinegar. So by the time you do that second turning of the beans, you get a very strong vinegar smell. What happens is that you have the acetic acid that is produced by the acetic acid bacteria entering the bean through the microbial, or through the point where the seed would emerge. So it enters through this point here and diffuses inside of the bean. And then it breaks down the polyphenols, tannins, the heavy molecular weight proteins into lower molecular weight proteins. They are broken down to amino acids. And that is where the flavor profile or the genetic flavor potential is unlocked. By breaking down these proteins into amino acids, you unlock that genetic flavor potential. So it's the acid that infiltrates the bean through this one point here, the point where the seed would germinate from. That acid permeates into the cotyledon, and if you cut a bean during fermentation, you'd see a sort of purple liquid oozing out, and that is the polyphenols, the anthocyanins and tannins that are very bitter being broken down and oozing out of the bean. So this process of breaking down the proteins, and there are 5 types of proteins that are present in the bean that break down. It's the reason why it is we get beans that have a floral note, a fruity note, etc. It's the same way when we cook meat, which is protein. Lamb tastes like lamb, fish tastes like fish, chicken tastes like chicken, because the amino acid profile that is expressed through cooking brings out different aromatics or aromas. Now, at this point, we have a sort of stasis, a point where the internal and external acidity of the beans meet. And it is at this point where we have the maximum expression of flavor potential. If fermentation were to continue beyond that point, we have the acetic acid bacteria declining in their activity. And then we have other aerophilic bacteria and filamentous fungi becoming dominant. And the products that these microorganisms produce do not smell good, they do not taste good. This is where you get those sort of sweaty odors, cheesy odors, butyric sort of notes coming in if fermentation were allowed to continue. You also get notes of ammonia if fermentation is allowed to continue even more, because we have the amino acids that would have been produced by the breakdown of the proteins. The amino acids start to break down themselves and they release the ammonia component of their metabolic structure. And then you get ammonia, which is, once you get that, that's it. It's the bean is no way usable. Now, one key thing that causes variable fermentation that exists in the real world out there is delayed filling of the fermentation box, whether or not it's a basket or a box. Sometimes we have these large boxes or large vessels that occur on farms, and we, especially at the start of the crop, where we don't have enough beans coming in, sometimes you get farmers, they would put in some beans, then they would harvest some more after 2 or 3 days, or they would get some from their neighbor that would have been harvested a few days before, put it in. So you have this sort of layering of beans going into a fermentation mass of different fermentation start times. And depending on how you count the actual start time of this fermentation system, you get beans that are either very much over fermented, like would occur in this yellow layer here, beans that might be under fermented in this pale layer here, or beans that would just be not fully fermented. So this is something that's not allowed. It happens a lot, but it contributes to a lot of the variability in flavor that we get. So one way of dealing with this is that at the Cocoa Research Center, we promoted and optimized and tested small scale fermentation boxes that in themselves have internal dividers. So this box holds about 200 kilograms of wet cocoa beans and can be divided into half and quarter. So what's important is that if you have a small volume of cocoa going into fermentation, you need to have some vertical element to this mass in terms of putting it to ferment. So having a chamber that's tall helps. So that's why the boxes have these dividers that can be removed. So we can very discreetly have 1/4 of this box filled, which is 50 kgs, or half, which is 100. So this is a simple change that can make a big difference to avoid this from happening. And this is what the actual boxes look like. I've been using these for a number of years and they work well. We have optimized these against large scale fermentation systems where we have 1,000 kilograms of cocoa beans going into fermentation at the same time. So my colleague Naila Ali, who's on this call also, she would have done a lot of work optimizing this as well. So I want to get to the point now of how do we know when fermentation is ready? So if you were to employ your approach to cooking, you can either use time, you can use smell, you can use taste. A similar approach can be taken for cocoa. So this graph here shows many things. On the x-axis, we have time measured in hours. On this axis here, we have temperature measured in degrees centigrade. And on the other axis, we have pH or acidity, where the lower the number, the more acid it is. We have this red line here, which represents the temperature of the fermentation mass. We have the sort of purple line that represents the pH of the cotyledon, and the green line that measures the pH of the tester. You can see at the start of fermentation, the tester tends to be a bit more acidic than the cotyledon. And of course, if you were to suck the pulp off of a fresh bean, you would see that it is acidic. There's a tart taste to it. So we start off fermentation. Usually it starts about 26 degrees centigrade and it continues. The red arrows are when this fermentation mass was turned. And you can see as fermentation continues, where we have the microflora succession towards acetic acid bacteria and the acidification of the cotyledon. This point here is where we have the entrance of the acetic acid and breakdown of the proteins. Now you see these small wings here on these points. These represent confidence intervals. And this is where science contributes to making the best decision. Now, if I were to look at this, I would say, oh, the optimal endpoint is 144 hours. That's where they meet. But if I look at the confidence interval between the repetitions of measurements that are taken, you can see that the confidence interval actually overlaps here. So between 96 to 120 hours is actually the optimal time to end this fermentation. And it coincides to when we have the temperature of the fermentation mass dropping, which indicates that the microorganisms are starting to decline in their activity. Ideally, we want to make sure that the fermentation mass crosses 44.5 degrees centigrade in terms of temperature for bean death to occur. So this mass would, the highest temperature I've seen in a fermentation mass is about 51 degrees centigrade. And this is taking measurements across the top profile of the box at different depths as well. And we can see, we have measured this where um, as fermentation continues and turning occurs during fermentation, we have a homogenization of the mass. So the temperature profile of the fermentation mass becomes more uniform. At the start, we have higher temperatures at the top compared to the middle and bottom. But as fermentation progresses and we have mixing occurring, we have more uniform temperatures occurring across the fermentation mass. So using our same approach as we would for cooking, we can take measurements, we can cook according to time, according to the recipe, or we can adopt a more nuanced approach where we use our senses to really optimize how flavors have been developed. We can smell, it's fruity at the start, alcoholic at the first turn, acidic on the second turn. If we get a smell of spoiled milk after the second turning, then we know we have too much lactic acid bacteria. If we get ammonia present as a smell, we know that that's bad. If we get putrid aromas, we know that that's also bad. So we can use our senses to really understand a fermentation. We can cut beans to look inside. So we're using our sense of sight or sense of smell. So this is what beans look like at the start of fermentation. This is where we have the start of the acidification. You notice the purple color has really changed. We have a more opening up of the cotyledon. We have less pulp compared to the start. So the yeast would have broken down the pulp. Towards the end, we have oxidation occurring, where we not only would have lost a lot of the bitter tannins and polyphenols, we have an opening up of the cotyledon. We have the breaking down of cells, with fat is released, and we have oxidation occurring here to really lock in the flavor that is expressed during this stage here. So at the end of fermentation, going into drying, this is where we have a bean that has a lot of acidity present, a lot of acetic acid present. And whether or not we employ open sun drying, covered sun drying, or artificial drying, the main thing that we're trying to do is to get moisture out of the bean, have oxidation and non-enzymatic browning that occurs to lock in flavor potential. But we also have some manipulation of drying rate, whether or not it's by the temperature of the air around the bean, on how we turn the beans, and how deep the layer of beans during drying is how that bean depth is managed. Now, one critical element of drying is the tempering that occurs during the nighttime. Because how drying occurs really is that drying occurs at the surface. So the point of dynamic exchange where the water changes form is on the surface, right? We have warm air drying moisture from the surface of the bean and then pulling moisture from inside the bean out. Now, when this occurs in a gradual motion, we also have moisture coming out with acetic acid. And the tempering stages during the nighttime is where we have the migration of moisture from inside of the bean coming to the surface to be dried during the daytime or during the times when we have heat being applied, whether or not this heat is applied from the sun or by artificial means. If we were to employ too rigorous or too intense an initial drying rate, we get too much drying on the surface and we get something called case hardening. This case hardening leads to the beans becoming shriveled on the outside, but also traps acetic acid inside of the bean. It cannot migrate outside. So you get very acidic tasting beans. So this is where you then have to manipulate your roast and your conch times to deal with this excessive acidity. So you see the impact is already happening where we have that personality being locked from fermentation into drying. So it dictates what you can and cannot do during chocolate making. So the care and attention, well, actually, no, I will speak about that when we go into when things go wrong. Um, the care and attention that is paid during fermentation and drying needs to also extend to storage. I have seen so many instances where bean to bar chocolate makers have their beans stored in their garage, in the kitchen. They have their weed whackers stored next to their beans because it's in the garage. They have paint. They have their car parked in the garage. So storage should protect the beans from moisture. They should be well ventilated, so it should be sheltered, should be ventilated. It should not allow for increasing the moisture content of the beans. So at the end of fermentation, beans have about 60% moisture content. You dry these beans down to between 6.5 to 7.5% moisture content. If you go beyond 8, you have enough free water present on the bean to facilitate secondary mold growth. So those filamentous fungi that we have that could occur at the end of fermentation, they are also present in the environment, and all they need is some moisture, and then you get secondary mold growth. Similarly, you can get negative odors being transferred from the storage environment to the beans in storage. I have witnessed beans that they were very dry. They went into a storage area that had a lot of cardboard boxes, and the beans tried to equilibrate by absorbing moisture from the environment to equilibrate, and the beans ended up tasting like cardboard. We also have pest infestation that occurs during storage. We live in the tropics. We have a lot of creatures that really want to eat these beans. So we have tropical warehouse moths, wherever we have grain stored, so we have to use pheromone traps, blue light bug zappers. We have rodents, we have roaches. We have many pests that want to infest cocoa beans in storage, and we have to employ the most appropriate techniques and food safe techniques to treat against pest infestation. I'll give you an example of how rigorous the market is. Japan is very rigorous in terms of testing for pesticide residues. And I know of a farmer who had beans in storage, and he had a problem of tropical warehouse moths. So he bought Baygon. So you know Baygon insecticide that you spray for different flying insects. So you have Baygon for flying insects, Baygon for crawling insects. So this farmer sprayed Baygon for flying insects. He got rid of his moths because they died. When these beans went to Japan and they did the pesticide residue testing, they actually found the active ingredient present in Baygon in these beans, and the shipment was earmarked for rejection. And it was only after a significant price discount then they purchased the beans, because then they would now have to blend these beans with another origin. So these things are real. Okay, so this is probably my next favorite slide because it's easy to teach when things go wrong. In the pre-harvest environment, we have squirrels, woodpeckers, rats, different things that are present in the natural environment in the field that would damage pods. You might think that, oh, these beans are not bad, the pod is just damaged. But once the pod wall is compromised, these beans start to ferment. So if you put these beans into the fermentation matrix, they would have already been fermenting. So they will become over fermented. Secondly, we have beans that are diseased. These beans should not be incorporated into the fermentation matrix. Next, we have beans that become damaged during pod opening. The use of the machete during pod opening damages beans, and these beans will not ferment properly, and they contribute to over roasted notes and foreign odors coming into your fermentation. In fermentation, of course, if you mix in diseased beans, or disease or rotted beans or beans with secondary mold or pieces of placenta in your fermentation, all of these things have a negative impact on the expression of these, on the succession of microorganisms that would occur in fermentation. Germinated beans, as I said, this is such an insidious problem where the bean looks fine, but this radical that is emerging here creates so many problems later on. Then we have during drying. Now, you can do a good job during fermentation. You end it at the point that you think is optimal, and you put it out to dry, and you have a sun drying system, an open sun drying system, and you have rain. So you cannot open the beans to receive sunlight because it will get wet. And what happens is, especially in the initial stages of drying, you get fermentation continuing. So you get the filamentous fungi and aerophilic bacteria growing on the surface of the beans and growing inside. So this is my hand here. These are beans I took off a drying floor that got 2 extra days fermentation because there was rain outside and fermentation continued. So a farmer has a hard job. A farmer has to be a weatherman as well to predict what's the weather going to be like next week when beans are going out to dry. So that if need be, might have to stop fermentation even earlier, understanding that it's going to get back this fermentation in the early days of drying because it's going to be raining. So you have to modulate the system. So that's why a recipe book approach to fermentation really doesn't work. It doesn't work all the time. It works some of the times because it's operating in a dynamic environment. Similarly, if you are following a recipe for cooking and they say to cook for 30 minutes, but you have a stove that's old or a stove that's very new, that was very efficient, you might have to modulate that cooking time. And the way how you modulate that is by sight, smell, and taste. This is a photo I took of beans drying on the side of the highway. This is where the mindset and change between cocoa bean as a food has not occurred. It's viewed as something that's just processed, dried as fast as you can. This happens. I have seen a situation where we have livestock walking through beans both during drying and storage. This is a shipment of beans that I saw that entered into Germany where the beans got wet during the drive from the storage area to the port for being shipped. They arrived in Germany with mold on them. The beans were totally moldy inside. This is a bean that's infested with tropical warehouse moth larvae, right? If you have these beans present in a batch and you try to make bean to bar chocolate with this, you're gonna get beans that taste moldy, beans that taste buggy, and beans that taste like animal. It's very real. Similarly, if drying is done where you have an open flame, open fire, whether or not it's a wood burning, a wood fuel fire or coal fire, you get beans that are smoky. A lot of the production from PNG, Papua New Guinea, suffers from this smoky taint because they have a lot of rain during the peak of the crop. So it's about optimizing your drying conditions and storage conditions as well. So going into some food safety concerns now. So remember, I made a definition of quality where we have the food safety element, but you also have specifications and limits or ranges by which things can be allowed to vary. So we have maximum limit is 8%. I say 7.5% for moisture content. We want to have less than 1% foreign materials or absent if possible. No one wants to have a stone going into roasting and then going into a bean breaker or worse yet, a mélanger. That's going to be a disaster. Now, slaty beans. So this is where it gets interesting, where industry plays a lot of emphasis on beans that are fully fermented. Beans that are slaty are unfermented or under fermented. Beans that are fully fermented tend to be brown in color or have some shade of brown. But if you have beans that are partly purple, partly brown, they are not viewed as a commercial defect. There's no regulation against that. They're not slaty, they are not unfermented. They are slightly under fermented. And I found that you get some interesting flavor development in beans that tend to be partly purple, partly brown, but in a ratio. So if you have too much partly purple, partly brown beans in a a batch for chocolates, you can get more bitter and astringent flavors, but you also get a bit more interest of flavors sometimes when you have beans that are partly purple, partly brown. It's all about how you tweak your formulation on your recipe. Of course, all flavors you want them to be absent. Moldy beans, for me, this is what the industry has as their standard. But I think really absent or at 1% probably, because it's and this is internal mold that we are talking about here. If we have, so there are regulations for PAHs or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from artificial drying. There are regulations for heavy metals, for cadmium, OTA. There's no regulation for it at the moment, but they use the same level as for coffee. Then we have mush and more, which is mineral oils that tend to be used to treat the jute fibers in jute bags. So there are standards for these. So you need to be aware of what are the standards that exist in your area, in whether or not you're in Europe or the US, or which market your national standard subscribes to. So you need to understand that. I will just spend 2 slides on understanding cadmium because it's such an important thing facing the industry right now. What is cadmium? Cadmium is a heavy metal. It's an intrusive mineral. It's retained in the kidney and liver. It has a long half-life. It causes bone demineralization. It competes in the body with calcium for absorption. It occurs in soil naturally in areas where you have volcanic soils. It can also be present in the soil as a result of mining or industry or the use of fertilizer with cadmium. So a lot of the phosphates that is present in fertilizer has some cadmium in it. However, not all cadmium present in the soil is bioavailable to the plant. Now, I am not an expert in cadmium. This is not my area of expertise. I'm just presenting some information. I have a link here that you can go to learn more from at the Cook Research Center. Cadmium is taken up by the plant, and there are specific pathways that are used for the absorption and accumulation of cadmium in the plant. There is an observed variability in terms of the accumulation of cadmium in different varieties. So it's possible to identify low cadmium accumulating varieties, and it is possible to treat cadmium levels in the soil by making it less available to the plants by altering the soil pH, but also pragmatically blending of beans from areas where you don't have cadmium to reduce the overall cadmium content, right? So at the moment, the acceptable limit is less than 0.8 milligrams per kg as the EU limit for cadmium. So anything above this is generally rejected. This is in beans, right? What I wanted to show, and I actually found this yesterday, and I thought it would be interesting for people who want to understand, well, okay, what does that mean for estimating the cadmium levels in the cocoa mass or the solids. So for example, so this is a formula that the EU has given, and this is where if you go to this website, you can get some more information about it. So with this formula, you can use what's the maximum levels in the cadmium that's allowed and the percentage of the cocoa mass in the finished product to estimate the maximum levels of cadmium in the cocoa mass that is being used. So this is a formula that I thought would be interesting, that I wanted to share with you, so you can go on this website to get more information about it. All right, so I'm starting my wrap up here. I just wanted to highlight, as I mentioned before, the interconnectivity of all the steps in cocoa post-harvest processing, where we can call it critical control points. And we can see almost every step in the process is a critical control point, because it has an impact on quality, from harvesting the pods, opening the pods, sorting the beans, filling the fermentation boxes, how fermentation is carried out, emptying the fermentation boxes, transportation, and storage. All of these things have an impact on quality and flavor, and ultimate flavor expression that we get. So we can say cocoa flavor development is linked to the genetic composition of the bean, that genetic flavor potential that's expressed through fermentation and drying, and then through the manufacturing of chocolate, where our roast profile that we use, our formulation, and how long we conch for, and how intense that conching process is, fine-tunes that expressed flavor in our product. So the good thing is that, as I mentioned before, a lot of the quality problems that we see could arises from if any of these steps that I mentioned before are not followed. We can use our sense of sight, smell, and taste to identify and assess these problems. And we should look at a quality management system that kind of follows the definition that I started off this talk with, where we look at the physical bean attributes, we look at flavor, but also we consider and look at what are the national standards that govern cocoa, either cocoa beans or chocolates, so that we ensure that what we do in the end in making chocolate is in line with national standards. And if we don't have national standards, there are market requirements. Buyers would have their requirements for beans that we need to understand as well. So I would just want to present a short video before I take questions about the work of the Cocoa Research Center. So I'm going to stop sharing this now and just show this video. Okay, it's 4 minutes and 28 seconds. I'm going to share screen again, and it's going to be this video here. Share. And
we have a very vibrant team that works on research. At the Cocoa Research Center, we have a very vibrant team that works on research, conservation, and outreach activities. This team consists of people who work on disease resistance, morphology of cocoa and the varieties of cocoa we have, genetics and DNA fingerprinting, quality of cocoa, and how the quality can be managed to improve the value of cocoa. The Cocoa Research Center was established in 1930. So we have 87 years of experience in working on cocoa-related research and outreach activities. The Cocoa Research Center has 3 major mandates. The first is the conservation of genetic resources. So we have an international cocoa gene bank, which has 2,400 varieties of cocoa. And this gene bank is used to support breeding programs around the world. So for breeders, we supply different varieties that they need for breeding purposes from Trinidad through an intermediary quarantine at the University of Reading at the United Kingdom. The second mandate is research. We support research in a variety of areas, including improving productivity of the cocoa plant, overcoming challenges that cocoa faces, such as diseases, drought, and cadmium, And we also work on improving quality of cocoa through various methods of processing the cocoa beans. With regard to outreach, we provide a variety of training programs in chocolate making, in training in grafting methodologies, improving the productivity through various methods of disease management, and we also offer training in sensory analysis. In the area of technical assistance, we have supported many countries in the Caribbean region, as well as in Latin America, with regards to improving quality along the value chain and improving productivity. With regards to research, we offer research assistance to some of the major chocolate companies in the world, such as Mondelez and Mars and Nestle and so on. One of the areas in which our research has focused on is to reducing the amount of cadmium contamination in cocoa beans. We have a project that is funded by the European cocoa industry to reduce the amount of cadmium absorption by the plant. And we are looking at a number of approaches to reducing this contamination. We also work on drought tolerance. In many parts of the world where drought is becoming an important constraint to cocoa production, there is a threat that cocoa production will not be able to continue in these areas. So we are looking at varieties in our international collection that can tolerate drought. And these varieties could be supplied to breeders who can now develop varieties of cocoa tolerant to the drought. Trinidad and Tobago had a very lucrative cocoa industry in the 1920s, when Trinidad used to produce 30,000 to 40,000 tons of cocoa, and it was one of the mainstays of Trinidad and Tobago's economy. But over the years, the industry has declined, and at the present time, the industry produces about 300 to 400 tons of cocoa, which is a minuscule of what we used to produce. The objective of the Cocoa Research Center is to revive the production through working with farmers to increase their business models. So through this, we are hoping that we can increase the productivity of cocoa and therefore the profitability of the farmer, so that farming of cocoa will become an important industry in Trinidad and Tobago. We are also supporting the value addition industry so that we can convert the cocoa that we produced into value-added products such as chocolates and beverages and cuisines and so on, so that we can build a value-added industry around the cocoa sector, so that it creates employment opportunities for persons in Trinidad and Tobago.
Right. So I will start back sharing my screen again.
Ang Department of Agriculture kaupod ang Department of Trade and Industry kag Cacao Council ang kahiwat.
Right. So so I would just like to end here and to thank you all. So a lot of questions.